Formula 1 is a technological race to produce the best car. Teams generally make a new car every year with big upgrades. You can't just take parts off a 2023 Ferrari and put it in a 2024 Ferrari. F1 cars have radical changes to the chassis all the time, but there are occasions where Formula 1 teams have mastered the art of recycling, and I'm going to rank F1's recycled cars based on how absurd they are. You're probably wondering why I'm ranking by absurdity rather than the number of seasons a car has run, and that's because if I ranked it by the number of seasons it'd be quite a boring video because there's about a 15-way tie there. One of the more notable recent examples of the Formula 1 recycling industry is the 2021 season. Because of interruptions as a result of the 2020, the Formula 1 2021 technical regulations were delayed until 2022 to cut costs. As a result of this, almost the whole field didn't develop 2021 cars, instead reusing their 2020 cars with minor updates to suit some minor rule changes that were implemented to keep downforce from exceeding 2020 levels. Unfortunately, most of the teams decided to give their cars a new chassis number, which is not how F1 chassis numbers are supposed to work. Only Red Bull got it right by calling their car the RB16B. But even they got it wrong by then skipping the RB17 and going straight to RB18. At least they fixed that error with the RB17 sports car, but the 2021 season is perhaps the least absurd example of car recycling in Formula 1, as all the teams had a really good reason not to develop entirely new cars for the 2021 season. It's not the first time a crisis has stopped the development of new cars though. World War II was another crisis that stopped the development of new cars too. Of course, Formula 1 was not around before World War II, but that doesn't mean there weren't pre-war cars that complied with Formula 1 technical regulations post-war. Since there was no race car development during the war, since engineers were kind of busy doing more important things, race car technology in 1950 was pretty much exactly where it was in 1939. And on the grid for the 1950 season were several cars designed in the 30s, including the Alfa Romeo 158 driven by the 1950 world champion Giuseppe Farina, which was originally designed in 1938. But of course, given the circumstances, there's nothing absurd about this so far. What is absurd is continuing to use a 1930s design into the late 50s. For some odd reason, during the 50s, the Indy 500 was a round of the World Championship of Drivers, and entering the 1957 Indy 500 was Danny Cladis driving a Maserati 4CLT48, a 1948 update of the original 1939 car, meaning he was driving a 9-year-old variant of an 18-year-old car. This is pretty absurd, but at least there was a pretty good reason for why they were doing this back then. But even purpose-built Formula 1 cars were frequently reused in the early years of Formula 1. The Lotus 49, one of the most famous Formula 1 cars of all time due to it being the first car to have the engine as a structural component, would debut in 1967. It ended up finishing second in the Constructors' World Championship. The car had good potential, so they decided to race it again in 1968, updating it to the 49B by adding wings for the Monaco Grand Prix. This will be the first appearance of wings in Formula 1, although not the first ever race car to use wings for enhancing cornering performance. That goes to a Swiss privately entered Porsche 718. The 49B would continue racing until 1970, and the 49C until 1971, but its successor, the Lotus 72, released in 1970, was going to take the art of recycling much, much further. The original 72 was another extremely famous car. It was the first F1 car with side pods, removing the frontal radiator, reducing weight and improving aerodynamics massively, and would set the shape that all Grand Prix cars would follow until today. Well, at least until these clowns showed up and tried whatever this is. Words cannot begin to explain just how influential the Lotus 72 was. It was a debut in round 2 of the 1970 World Championship, and the 1970 season would see 3 variants of the Lotus 72 used: the original 72, the 72B, and the 72C. In 1971 they'd continue with the 72C, introducing the 72D, and they keep coming up with new variants until 1975 with the 72F. The reason they kept reusing the Lotus 72 was that the design was so good that they could just keep updating the original car for 6 years straight. They won the Constructors' Championship in 1970, 1972 and 1973 with a Lotus 72. It was quite common for the top teams to reuse cars in the 1970s though. The McLaren M23 also did 6 seasons. One car that seems to have done the most seasons though was the Ferrari 312, which was first entered in 1966 and entered its final race in 1980, but this is not correct. The Ferrari 312 was actually a whole bunch of different cars with the same chassis number because Ferrari are insane. Ferrari model names and F1 chassis numbers often denote engine displacement and number of cylinders. 312 meaning 3 litre V12, the same way the Ferrari 458 has a 4.5 litre V8 and the 296 has a 2.9 litre V6. This doesn't always work this way because the Ferrari 430 does not have a 4 litre V30 or a 4.3 litre V0. But it's not just in the times of dinosaurs when F1 cars were reused by their teams. In the 2000s, the Grand Prix recycling industry was looking stronger than ever. Well, maybe not quite as strong as the 70s, but still. McLaren made some mistakes developing the radical MP4-18. So they had to create the MP4-17D for 2003. What happened to the MP4-17B and C is anyone's guess. It wasn't just McLaren who reused their 2002 car in 2003. Ferrari hadn't finished developing the F2003 in time for the 2003 season, so they used the F2002B for the opening 4 rounds of 2003, with Michael Schumacher managing to win the San Marino Grand Prix with a year-old car. McLaren would still remain strong with their old car, with Kimi Raikkonen just 2 points off Michael Schumacher by the end of the season, and McLaren just 16 points from Ferrari in the Constructors. One team that was not present on the 2003 Formula 1 grid was Arrows, and more specifically their car, the A23. So surely, with a team collapsed and the era of F1 privateers being over and the car not entered in 2003, you'd think that would be the end of the road for the Arrows A23. But it turns out the Arrows A23 would live on, not in 2003 when it was well and truly gone for the grid, but Minardi decided to buy a whole lot of bits from the defunct Arrows team, including the A23, and in 2004 they showed up with the Minardi PS04, which was actually just a B-spec of the 2002 Arrows A23. Minardi would then continue to use the PS04 in the opening rounds of 2005 before retiring the car. In a sane world, these 2 seasons would be the end of the story of the A23, with team principals realising they can't keep beating the dead horse of a 3-year-old car that wasn't even successful in the first place. That would have been the case if Aguri Suzuki didn't decide he wanted an Arrows A23 as well for part of the new team, Super Aguri. The team was funded by Honda, so swapped out the Cosworth V10 for a Honda V8 in line with the new 2006 F1 regulations, and they named the car the SA05. But the Arrows A23 had made its way onto the 2006 F1 grid regardless. Halfway through the year, they'd B-spec the car with the SA06, but this was still an Arrows A23 underneath. Finally, at the end of 2006, they laid the Arrows A23 to rest and decided to instead reuse the Honda RA106 for 2007. But this is not the most absurd example of F1 recycling. The most absurd example goes back to the 1980s, where a car was not only used in 6 seasons despite never being good in any season, but also featured another Italian team with an insane chassis number system, the Osella FA1. The FA1 is actually 3 separate cars used by 3 teams between 1980 and 1991. But for some reason they decided to label entirely new cars like their B-specs, but also labelling B-specs the same way. So working out which Osella FA1 is which is incredibly annoying, especially because the team didn't keep the best records, with some FA1 variants having chassis numbers from other variants in incredibly confusing ways. The first Osella FA1 had 5 variants and raced between 1980 and 1983, scoring 3 points across 4 seasons. They used the Cosworth DFV, a modification of an engine that was first seen in 1967, from 1980 until 1983, when they swapped it out for an Alfa Romeo V12 in 1983, but only on one of their cars for a few rounds. But it was 1984 when Osella finally decided to switch to a new car, and this one would go turbocharged. Except for the fact that it wasn't a new car at all, it was actually just the previous year's Alfa Romeo, the 183T. The 183 stands for one car, 8 cylinders, 3 of them work. In the hands of Andrea de Cesaris and Mauro Baldi, the car picked up 19 retirements and 2 podiums in 1983. Osella decided it would be a wise decision to buy this car, and then rename it to the Osella FA1F, despite it not being an Osella FA1, with some FA1Fs still having Alfa Romeo markings on parts of the chassis. The FA1F would pick up 14 retirements and a best finish of 5th in 1984. Despite entering only one car in most of the rounds, this would be the last time Osella would ever score points. For whatever reason, Osella would keep this car in 1985, updating it to the FA1G, entering only one car. The reliability would improve, with only 6 retirements recorded in 1985, but this would be the best reliability the Alfa Romeo 183T would see in a season. In 1986, Osella would manage to rack up 21 retirements with a best finishing position of 11th. By 1988, Osella had reached the FA1L, which would be the final variant of the Alfa Romeo 183T after 6 seasons, a car which should have probably been abandoned even before completing one season, but inexplicably continued racing until 1988. Regulation changes meant that Osella finally decided to get a new car for 1989, which they called the Osella FA1M, despite not being an Osella FA1. It was a new chassis and would have been called the FA3 if the team had put more thought into it. With turbos outlawed, they put a Cosworth DFR, a modernised version of the 1960s Cosworth DFV yet again, which would power the car. In 1990, they would use the FA1M again, but with a B-spec called the FA1ME. But Osella was finally sold to Fondmetal in 1990, and Osella was finally done with the FA1. However, Fondmetal was not done with the FA1 because their new car wasn't ready yet. So they decided they would yet again roll out the Osella FA1ME for the opening 2 rounds of the 1991 season, and then finally, the FA1 could be laid to rest as Fondmetal had finally phased it out.